Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Wednesday, May 28th, 2025, and on Wednesdays we delve into emotional well-being and relationships. So the heart's often symbolized as the seat of human emotion. Our hearts are also intricately connected to our mental states in more ways than we can probably fully understand at this point. So I recounted at the outset of this vlog series my near-death experience, NDE. It's the acronym that's often used, so near-death experience, NDE. Or what happened, essentially, when I died from a massive saddle pulmonary embolism. Pulmonary embolism, PEs. So I experienced then firsthand, directly, the connection between the heart and the brain in a profoundly unique way, as I'd like to explain. So briefly, a saddle PE, pulmonary embolism, is a large blood clot or a thrombus that gets stuck where the main pulmonary artery branches off into a Y shape to go into each of your two lungs. Okay, so basically the name highlights the fact that the clot it saddles on top of both branch arteries. So saddle PEs are relatively rare. They make up less than 5% of all PE cases, but they're quite dangerous because of the blockage to both branch arteries. And the pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood from the heart and to the lungs, where it's, of course, then loaded up with oxygen. If a saddle PE then blocks both pulmonary arteries, as in my case, then that's what leads to heart failure and death. So that's essentially what happened to me. Right? I was simply lucky in the sense that my wife was there, as I explained earlier, and she was able to intervene. However, not with CPR, which is what you normally think, especially since the initial thought is that, oh, somebody must be suffering from a cardiac arrest. But rather, she intervened by turning me on my side and unknowingly slightly dislodged the PE. And so I was then, great. I was saved and I was transported to the ER, diagnosed, received blood thinners, and remained as still as possible for 3 days, basically in the hospital, to let the thrombus start to dissolve. And then I had to take it easy for a couple of months even after that. And now I'm on blood thinners for the rest of my life. But I'm retelling this story briefly for a couple of reasons. So first, I remember the actual process of dying. Again, I've shared a little bit of this previously. I don't have the awesome stories that some people are able to tell when they remember being dead and floating above their bodies and maybe seeing the face of God or their loved ones, all these sorts of things. I wish I did, but I remember nothing from my few minutes while I was clinically dead. Sorry. But I remember quite vividly the moments before, or, just leading up to my death, and what I was feeling and thinking as I died. And all of these memories then were connected my head with my heart, if you will. So what do I mean? Well, I remember getting to the top of the stairs and then feeling something was really, really starting to fail me in terms of my blood flow and my breathing. There's no question about that. And so I processed this information cognitively. And I thought to myself, geez, why do I feel so dizzy? And why am I starting to lose consciousness? And then my next thought was, hey, lie down, you idiot. Something really bad is happening. In fact, this is the first time ever in my life where I thought to myself, something horrible's actually happening to me physiologically, to my body. And yet I don't know what exactly. Yeah, I remember all of that quite vividly. So I lay down on the bed, I lay down on my back, and then here's what I remember thinking. Wow, this is really bad. It's not a heart attack, though. I'm not feeling that squeezing crushing sensation in my chest. So in other words, I wasn't experiencing the classic symptoms of a heart attack. And then my next thought was something along the lines of, well, if it's not a heart attack, what the heck is happening to me? Right? And then, wow, I can't do anything about this, whatever's happening. And this was my actual thought, but I'm definitely dying. And then I also remember what I was feeling as I was thinking these things too. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. My feeling was that of utter frustration and tinged with anger, if you will. I remember thinking, this is so ridiculous. I can't believe I'm just going to randomly die now. I have so much more I want to do. I know that was selfish on my part, just being frustrated with my own death and not thinking about how it might affect others. But I'm just being honest. And I didn't think, by the way, oh, I can still tell my wife and children that I love them, right? I wasn't thinking that. And I didn't even do the proverbial let's make a deal with God thing, right? God, if you'll just let me live, I promise to donate all of my money to charity, or I'll become a Catholic priest, or, whatever you want. Nothing like that. So instead, it was with a sense of helplessness and exasperation accompanying my final thought. Man, this really sucks. I'm just going to die now. And then that's what happened. Medically, my pulmonary arteries were blocked. I experienced heart failure, and I died. Basically, a switch just went off. I felt like I was Tony Soprano in that final episode of the Sopranos. But then I also remember coming back from the other side as well. It's a bit foggy, but I do remember vaguely being propped up. The EMTs and my wife talking to me, I remember. It was sort of like a distant voice, but then it gradually became louder and things started to come into focus. And I also remember then trying to respond to their queries. I know I remember thinking, I must sound like an idiot because I was sort of mumbling and stumbling over my words, which is actually what happened. But then I also remember quite well being taken down by the EMTs from the bedroom, which was upstairs, right? And then they were taking me down the stairs and to the ambulance. And I actually remember making this comment. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, hey, don't drop me down the stairs because that could kill me. Haha. Something like that. And I remember continuing then to respond to their questions on the way to the hospital. They were talking to me, trying to keep me alert, awake, etc. And I was also trying to joke around a bit more in my own silly way. So why is all this relevant then? Well, it's a powerful reminder that our heart and our mental states are profoundly interconnected. Even more, there's an intricate relationship between emotional well-being and cardiovascular health and physical health in general. So if you're not doing well emotionally, that has direct implications for both your head and your heart. At the very least, if we have an unhealthy lifestyle, if we're suffering from great stress in our lives, then we're increasing significantly our chances of suffering from heart disease, not to mention other ailments. All of which is to say then that my NDE and my experience and research since then have convinced me of the importance of holistic approaches to health, and one that recognizes the influence of our emotional landscape and our lifestyles and our mental frameworks on our physical well-being, and probably vice versa too. So, yes, you can and should get your annual physicals, right? You will need to tick off the different boxes and make sure that you're doing everything you can to maintain your physiological health. But at the same time, we have to manage our emotional, psychological, and mental, and dare I even say our spiritual well-being in concert with our physical health. Eating healthy or getting exercise are obviously crucial, but so is receiving the proper emotional and psychological and mental nourishment on a regular daily basis too. And that means then managing stress and our lifestyles effectively, or avoiding unhealthy levels of stress that can become toxic if left unattended. So if you're currently suffering then from a prolonged bout of emotional distress or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, just as a few examples, then you need to know that you're also putting yourself at risk for serious physical problems, such as cardiac arrest and a range of other problems. Okay, Dr. J. So then what explains your NDE with that saddle pulmonary embolism? Was there a dislodged clot from my leg? That's often a cause. No, not in my case. Was I suffering from being out of shape or not being physically active enough? Nope. In fact, they said that I had the physical fitness of someone 20 years younger. Great. Was it due to family or genetic risk factors? Well, I had the luxury of doing some extensive genetic testing because they couldn't find a cause in the hospital. So we did this genetic testing in the months that followed the PE, and including with, actually, I didn't know this, of course, but one of the world's leading experts in the field who examined my particular case. And guess what he found? Nothing. So in our final meeting, I asked the doctor what would explain my PE, since apparently I had none of the risk factors associated with lifestyle or eating or exercise habits or family history and genetics and so on. So, what accounts for this? And he explained, well, in a tiny percent of the cases, we just don't know. It's known as a random or idiopathic event. So I nodded in agreement, counted my lucky stars, and carried on with my life. But then I figured out what happened, or so I think. And by the way, only recently. I believe that nothing happens randomly per se, but rather there are varying degrees of probabilities, and that there are always underlying causes, usually multiple causes or intersecting forces at play in terms of what we observe and what we experience, especially as we understand it in this material world, even if we don't always know what they are. Okay, and so then I remembered reading not too long ago about patients who were struggling to understand how stress had affected their cardiac health. And the research revealed over and over again that upon delving into their life histories in greater detail, a pattern emerged. Most commonly, there was a linkage between emotional and stressful life events, like people who'd gone through, a divorce or the ending of a crucial relationship or a loss of a loved one, that sort of thing. And then the adverse effects in terms of their heart conditions. And so the patients were routinely surprised at the revelation. But the clinical implications highlighted the necessity of psychological interventions as part and parcel of standard cardiac care. But is that what the physicians or the heart specialists were recommending? Maybe some, but most cardiologists almost certainly don't focus on the psychological and emotional interventions, since that's not part of their core knowledge or their basic training. They're experts and specialists in physiology of the heart, the structure and the function of the heart. And so that's what they study, and that's where they recommend their interventions. I'm not faulting them at all for that. That's just the way the system's designed. We all tend to be specialists of various kinds. And so as a result, I decided to study my own situation a bit more scientifically and holistically. So listen up. I've actually never told anyone of my self-diagnosed cause of my saddle PE until now. I think I found the cause. Why did I get the saddle pulmonary embolism? Well, again, I don't know for certain, but I think I have a reasonable hypothesis. So hear me out. I believe that my idiopathic saddle PE was caused by something that I have called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So let me explain. And it's from childhood. Let me explain. How could that be? Well, again, I won't get into the details and the origins of all of that, but I was clinically diagnosed with complex or childhood PTSD a couple of years before nearly dying from the PE. Okay? And so as a result, I started in treatment to deal with my PTSD, which apparently I'd been suffering for the better part of, about 5 decades. Now, most people wouldn't actually know, including myself, most people wouldn't know that I suffered from PTSD because I'd learned to cope quite effectively. I mostly functioned well in my personal life, but not always, and almost always quite well in my professional life. But I'd have my moments here and there too, as my family can certainly attest. So when I learned about the PTSD, that was the life changer. And I started to work on overcoming the PTSD with therapy, with cognitive behavioral training, and reading a lot about what to do, with the use of emotional freedom technique or EFT or tapping, with an online program, some dietary changes, and a few other things. And perhaps most important of all, I ended the relationship with the two people who were most directly responsible for my childhood PTSD and who continued to trigger my PTSD many years later. And guess what? I finally started to get better after, again, probably 5 decades of suffering, again, mostly behind the scenes, mostly in the quiet of my own private thoughts and dreams and lack of sleep and that constant voice in my head that nobody else heard, but I heard all the time, which said that basically you're worthless, you piece of shit. Yeah, that's what was always running through my mind. It was as constant as my tinnitus, or tinnitus, you can say it either way, in my left ear. It's been ringing there for the decades as well. Anyway, so I was gradually then able to dislodge the underlying sources of my PTSD. And it took me roughly 2 to 3 years of hard work to get to that point. But then I'm hypothesizing that all of this work translated into the creation and the release of the thrombus. Unseen, unknown, undiagnosed, and of course the one that almost killed me. So here's the broader theme then for today. We often don't see what's hurting us, sometimes until it's too late. So our diagnostic systems are often too simplistic or too narrow in their focus. And so we end up missing the bigger picture, the complex interplay of forces that generate outcomes, both good and bad. But Dr. J, you say, you could have gotten a chest x-ray weeks earlier when your chest started to bother you, right? You went to see a doctor. So why didn't you just do that? It's not that difficult. And in fact, a chest x-ray was ordered. We did a couple of other things first, but then my doc ordered the chest x-ray. And I was actually going to have that done within a couple of days before suffering my NDE. But that actually proves my point further. It would have been much better, in my view, to understand the array of forces and stressors that were gradually producing the thrombus in the first place. In other words, to be more preventive rather than reactive. So to be more preventive, though, that would require a paradigm shift. So instead of just getting an annual physical, we have to think about life in a much more holistic way. And we have to be willing to investigate the complex adaptive systems that have these interactive components that produce tangible material and energetic effects. This logic and reasoning then apply to all aspects of the human and other systems, in my view. Yes, you can treat high cholesterol with medication, or you can treat trauma with counseling, Nothing wrong with that stuff. But that's still too linear, I think, in most cases. Instead, I'm proposing that we need to look at the multiple material and energy factors that interact and combine to produce a healthier or a less healthy heart, a healthier or a less healthy mind, and much more. And so these are the ideas then that I'll be developing and sharing with you in upcoming vlogs, both on our Wednesday explorations and with vlogs on other days of the week with other subject matters in related fashion. So to conclude today then, how can we mitigate the effects of stress and emotional turmoil on our hearts? Just as one example. So we all have to, I think, approach the problem more holistically and within a multidisciplinary framework, if you will, that includes lifestyle changes, a healthy diet, regular physical activity, stress management techniques, proper sleep, along with relaxation and meditation practices of various kinds, and by cultivating psychological and broader networks of social supports, both personal and at times professional in nature, depending upon our circumstances. And finally, by understanding that our hearts and our minds, and I think even our very souls, are more connected than we might have imagined. So if we can integrate our multiple sources of heart and mind care, we can move to much healthier states for ourselves, as well as encourage that for our loved ones. And then we can start to branch out into our communities and beyond. But let's just start with ourselves for today, okay? Or start with yourself if you haven't already. Do an environmental scan. What's healthy in your life? What are the potential toxins? And then try to figure out how all of these things sort of interact to produce your current circumstances, your current situation. What do you have control over? What can you change? What needs to be changed? And who knows? Maybe there's some major blockage that you're experiencing that ends up getting identified and then released. So just be careful and be prepared if that should happen. Otherwise, you'll end up like me, potentially in a hospital. And you don't want that to happen, or worse. Okay, so that's it for today. As I said, this is just the start of a much deeper dive and a more protracted understanding of the interplay of the complex forces that produce healthy and unhealthy outcomes, emotionally and mentally as well as physically. All right, much more to come. In the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.